Nerd Sports Podcast, where we talk history of the game, numbers and stats. And each week we highlight a charity that's doing good. If you haven't subscribed yet, then you should, because I'm this the real deal. And you know I gotta shout out the Buffalo Bills. Turn it up to the max, sit back and relax. This the Buffalo Nerd Sports Podcast. Let go.
Hey, what is up, everybody? Welcome in to another episode of the Buffalo Nerd. So this one's bright and early for me. I got 8 a.m. on my time here. It's a Friday, 5:21. The reason we're doing such an early start is because today I'm joined by a super special guest from, I guess people like to say, the other side of the pond. I'm not really sure why we call it a pond or where that came about or whatever. But I've got Tom Kislingbury with me today, and Tom's in England. And the reason that I really want to chat with Tom is besides doing a ton of other things that he does, he's a big time defensive guy. And he put out this thing that I started digging into. I mean, I geeked out when I saw it. I mean, the thing it's incredible. Just so everybody knows, it's not super favorable to the Bills necessarily. So we'll just get that out of the way to start. But welcome in, Tom. I'm super excited to chat with you. Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Thanks very much indeed. A pleasure to be here, and pleasure for having me. So thank you very much. As you can hear, I'm an Englishman that's desperately in love with football, and I have been for a long time. So I sort of got into football in the late 90s, really. The first game I ever watched, the Packers Broncos Super Bowl. So that tells you how old I am. And I just fell more and more in love with football, and learnt more and enjoyed it more as time went on. Mainly because it's really complicated, and I felt like I was always learning new things. And that's it. It's just been continuing for the last 20 plus years, really. So I tend to focus a bit more on the defensive side of the ball because I think it's really interesting and complicated. And there's a million people that can talk about wide receivers and running backs and people that carry the ball all day, but that's not what football is. Football's interesting because of the cat and mouse-ness of it. So I like learning about defense, about how it actually works, about what is going on beyond the obvious things, and that makes me happy. So I write about it and I talk about it, and fortunately, I'm in a position now where I can actually have good conversations about football with people from around the world, and that's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's awesome that, being out that not only because I know there's a Bills Mafia that's in the UK as well, right? So, I mean, there's guys that have shows over there that are Bills Mafia and things like that. So I know it's really taking storm over there for when the NFL started making the moves over there. So football is a big thing over there. And it's cool and it's exciting to hear you talk about it like that, right? Because it's very fun to just kind of dive into football. And I know a lot of people just think it's 11 on 11. It's like, well, yes, I mean, it's 11 on 11, but there's a lot going into that 11 on 11, right? There's a lot of money being spent.
So
a lot
much
of people
more.
are being paid to do certain things, right? So there's a lot taking place besides the 11 on 11. So the document is incredible. I mean, it's like 586 pages. I mean, it covers every team, does a little breakdown on every team. And then at the end, it kind of even gives you a breakdown. If you're not real familiar with defense, it gives you a breakdown of a lot of the defenses and what they're meant to do and what they're vulnerable to and that kind of stuff. So like the thing is incredible. Like I said, when I started looking at it, I was like, this is awesome. I got to the Bills and I was like, well, I'm not sure if I really like this guy that much, but but sometimes the honest truth is the best truth, right? So as I started looking at it, I was like, you know what? I can't really argue with what is being said in this about the team right now, and it's very fun. But we'll get into that before we dive too much into the football stuff. As we like to do every week on the Nerd, is we like to shout out, a charity or an organization that's doing, positive things, helping out their communities, all that good stuff. So this week, obviously, Tom got to choose who the charity is going to be, and he chose to highlight CJD. And so, Tom, why don't you go ahead? Because I don't think most people are going to know about CJD. As you sent it to me and I started researching it, I was not very familiar with it. So it's very cool. So why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about it and why you chose it?
It's a horrible disease, and thankfully, not many people do know much about it. And I would wish nobody knew about it. It's Creutzfeldt-Jakob Disease, so it's a neurological disease. Over here in the UK and Europe, it's commonly known for being related to what was called mad cow disease, bovine spongiform encephalopathy. Anyway, it's a brain disease, and it sort of messes up your brain, and you get fairly rapid neurological decay, and there's no cure. It's fatal, and it sucks. My father-in-law had it a few years ago, so we had to learn quite a lot about it, and it was pretty painful and pretty unpleasant. But there were a few charities that were involved that really helped a lot, helped us and helped him. So when I can, I'd like to do something for them.
Yeah, I mean, it's very cool. And I mean, it's straightforward. I want, when you go to the website, I mean, it tells you the information a little bit about it, but it's really straightforward. All they're trying to really do is raise money for research, because that's where they're at this point, right? Is there's no cure for it. They're not really sure what's going on with it
Yep.
from what I gathered, right? So it's pretty much, they just need to do research to try to figure out what's going on. And that's what this is all about. Basically, the curecjd.org is where you'll be able to go, to find more information about them. And obviously all that stuff will be in the show notes. But yeah, I always like to find out about new charities, and it's interesting to see, because there's always some kind of tie to it for the person. So it's cool that people are comfortable and feel cool that they can talk about that kind of stuff and tell me, because we've all had those kinds of things, right? I mean, my mom passed away from cancer. I have a son with cerebral palsy. There's things that are taking place with all of us every day, whether you're in the United States or the United Kingdom or wherever you are. It doesn't change that this stuff is happening everywhere, right? So it's still a cool organization. It's still something that maybe if you go look, I'm sure there's probably an organization here in the United States that's doing the same thing, right? So there's a local chapter of it, I'm sure, that you could find too. So like we always do, it'll be available for you so you can find out more. If you can donate, that's awesome. If you can just spread it around, that's awesome too. It's cool to talk about these things as well. So thanks a lot for bringing that up, Tom. Really appreciate it. So
No, thank you. It's really cool. I'm doing something for a good cause.
do you want to go ahead and start tearing apart the Bills now, or I know he's not going to tear
Well,
them
yeah,
apart,
let's talk
but
about the
I
Bills.
sent over
So,
some topics, and I'm like, let's talk about the Bills defense. And he was like, yeah, I mean, we can do that, but it's really boring, right? And if you
wow,
go look at this
there's a couple of
document,
ways
you'll see
into
why he
it.
says that. So tell me a
So
little
we
bit
should talk
about this
about that, right?
document.
So,
Yeah.
so the document was put together basically to go into last year. So it's a 2020 document. So there are a lot of things in there, the way I see football, the way I describe it, and the terms I use, and things like that. Because defense is pretty badly understood, I think. It took me a lot of learning and paying attention to get my head around defense, because there's just not a lot of resources out there, and those that are pretty basic and pretty poor, to be honest. There's a lot of assumptions just wrong. So what I did was, I always spend time studying every defense, but I looked at every single defense last year, and I watched a lot of football. I did a lot of data analysis, and I tried to define how defenses were different, what they were good at, what they were bad at, how they varied, how they attacked teams, how they acted, how they rotated personnel, blah blah blah, all those different things. Because normally you ask somebody and say, what's their defense? And they'll say, oh, it's a 4-3 or a 3-4. And that's it, which is just laughable, right? You'd never say, oh, what's that offense like? And you go, oh, they do screens. And that's it. And it's so inadequate. So I think we, the football business, are not very good at giving people enough information and giving people enough insight to be able to talk about how defense is different. So I wanted to do that. So the Bills are really interesting. Oh, we should talk about a general level of 2020 before we do anything. So first off, I'm sure everyone knows this anyway, but 2020 was awful. It was the worst year for defense in living memory. So before last year, we had all those conversations, right? If you don't have proper preseason like we had last year with COVID and lockdown, then what would happen? Would it impact the timing between receivers and quarterbacks, or offensive linemen, or defensive players more? And now we know, and the answer is emphatically it hurts defense way more. So numbers were just so bad across the board, and the only hypothesis has to be it was because of lockdown, and not having a chance to do things together really hurt them. A defense only as strong as its weakest link, not its best player. So fundamentally different. So defense was bad. Fine, the Bills' defense wasn't great, but that's against the backdrop of everyone being bad. But you sort of mentioned it. Sadly, I think it's a really boring defense. It's the most rigid defense in the league. Defense is super variable and super flexible. We always talk about it as an offense, right? You're going, oh, we need to create mismatches, and you're going to put your receiver in his space and you move him all around the formation, like moving someone to a different spot is some sort of cheat code. Obviously, defenses react to that. They don't just stand there going, oh, they've put a receiver out wide, let's just carry on. They changed this. So defense is becoming more and more flexible and more complicated. Safety is the most interesting position in the NFL, in my thought, because safety is not a guy who lines up deep anymore. Safety is the big, fast, strong guy that can do anything on the field. All of a sudden, it's not really safety. It's Swiss Army knife. So you've got a lot of teams that are investing in multiple safety looks. Sort of traditional dime is disappearing a little bit, and big dime is now standard across the NFL. But the Bills are one of the most rigid defenses. They basically go, well, we play 4-2-5 nickel, and that's it. And our nickel has got a cornerback in the slot, and we're going to have our 4 linemen, and we're basically going to put them in the same alignment every snap. And they sort of never change. So there's not a lot of variation from snap to snap when you watch the Bills. I mean, it's solid. It's not a terrible defense. They had some problems last year, but it's not awful. I mean, what do you think when you look at the Bills' defense? Apart from I love you, Bills, obviously.
Well, and so I actually don't do the love you Bills, and since I started reading the document, I went back and I looked a lot at like Tremaine Edmunds specifically. I started watching him just very closely on the field in some games and stuff like that. So I agree. I've thought that Leslie Frazier has been vanilla the entire time he's been the Bills defensive coordinator. They've always been the bend but don't break, right? I mean, that's how their mentality has been the past few years under Sean McDermott and Leslie Frazier. They had years where they're successful. This last year, it felt very blah, and you didn't see as you go back and you watch it slower and slower, and you just kind of look at it and go, you don't really see anybody flashing around or anything exciting happening. It really is just they want to just line up and just be like, our best guy is going to try to beat your best guy, and that's how we're going to go. But that just doesn't work when you don't have players that aren't and competing up to their level, or being able to, we'll get into some of the guys that you talk about a little bit in that aren't stepping up. And I think a lot of the Bills Mafia is on board with those 2 players specifically that you mentioned, in Ed Oliver and Tremaine Edmunds. There is some real question about if they can produce or not in this system. But I agree with you. It's very blah. I mean, in the past, I've seen where we've been better when we're kind of flying around, and you don't see that as much. And I agree that it is because they didn't have the off season, but I also feel like maybe that's why we were so generic this last season, was because they wanted to just keep it simple, because they didn't have the extra time to put in the extra packages, and they had a unit that was pretty much kept together, right? So they didn't really have to change very much. They should know what we're doing, right? It's just a matter of, can they compete at the level we need them to? And last year we saw that they couldn't.
Yeah, I agree. That's a really good way of summing up. To be honest, there was definitely not many stars on that defense last year. You talk about Ed Oliver, and really it was all set up for him to step forward and be really good, and it just didn't happen. I thought Ed Oliver was really disappointing last year, and I'd love him to be good. I really want him to turn into the player we want him to be. Same with Tremaine Edmunds, and he's just not. He's not very good. Let's start out talking about Edmunds a little bit, because that's probably going to be a little bit of a negative story, and I don't think people will take it very well. But a general linebacker thing that happens quite a lot, right? If you ask somebody who the best linebackers in the NFL are at the moment, they're probably going to say Devin White, pretty close to the top of the list. And the reason is because most of the time we watching football, very much me included as well, watch the ball, right? Because it's exciting. We want to see passes and we want to see touchdowns, stuff like that. And you only watch defense when they do something and when the commentator calls his name out, which they do quite often for Devin White because he's a pass rusher, right? Devin White's done it again in the Super Bowl. Devin White, brilliant. Devin White was MVP at the Super Bowl. Blah 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 blah. He was so good. Obviously, he wasn't. That's what people were saying. What happens with linebackers specifically is their name never gets called for being a bit rubbish in zone coverage and allowing completions. No commentator ever says that about a linebacker, and that's the biggest problem linebackers have, because offenses are smart, and trying to isolate a linebacker in zone or man is basically the best way to attack them. And Tremaine Edmunds, sadly, allows that quite a lot. He gets picked on, he gets targeted quite a lot because he's not particularly good at stopping the pass. So I appreciate a lot of people love him, and he's got the trifecta, right? Well, he's got 2 out of 3. He's got long, memorable hair, and he was a first-round pick. If only he had a really interesting, crazy name, then everyone would think he's good forever, right? Jadeveon Clowney, right? He's got the crazy hair, he's got the name, he's got the first-round pick. So people are going to think Jadeveon Clowney's good for all time. But Tremaine Edmunds got 2 out of 3, so not too bad. There's got to be a decision based on him, right? Because the team seem to be quite happy with him, but I don't think he's worth that crazy big money. I think Matt Milano is a better player. Now, fine, he wasn't last year. He was injured. He was in and out of the team. When he came back, he was sort of sharing with AJ Klein of all people. So it wasn't a good year for Milano, but I think over the last 2 or 3 years, he's been the better player.
Yeah, it's interesting. So on Edmunds, as I went back and I was watching, that's the first thing I thought, because coming into this last season, or the offseason here, we were talking about, is it going to be Milano? Is it going to be Darrell Williams? Who are they going to keep? Like, they're only going to be able to keep one of them. So who are they going to keep? And I was on the Williams train saying I would much rather just keep the tackle and let Milano go, because I felt like we could fill the need. But then when I put on the film to watch Edmunds, all I see is Milano flashing around. I can't take my eyes
He's
off
really
of
good.
him. Right. I can't take my eyes off of him. I'm trying to watch Edmunds, but I know what Edmunds is going to do, because it's going to be kind of just slow and a little methodical and getting eaten up by the blocker, when Milano's like flying around doing things and you see him covering the field and doing all these things. So as you slow down and watch it, he does clearly look like the more effective, whether he's a better player or not, he's more effective in what he's doing right now than what Edmunds is, right? Whether Edmunds could be a better player than him and just hasn't found his way in it. But I agree. It's coming up to the point where, in the whole, he's young, you don't want to give up on a young guy. Well, yes, he's young and he's going to cost money because he's young. And is he truly going to be that much better, to where, if you're going to be this vanilla defense, I'm not sure he's active enough or aggressive enough to really represent what that defense needs him to be, if that's how they're going to operate. And a little bit on the Ed Oliver thing, I actually, like, with Starr being out, that killed him, right? He wasn't meant to be really in that position. Like, Starr is supposed to be eating up some of what he was supposed to be facing. So I'm actually hoping that we will see the breakout this year from him, because he should have somebody next to him that's going to be a little more help. And I'm hoping that this resurgence of youth is going to actually cause some kind of mix up, at least, where, can we go back to the days where we stunt at least a little bit? Like, give me a stunt. I would take a stunt at this point, right? Like that, like, we don't even do that anymore, I don't feel like. But I agree with your assessment really on both of those guys. And I know the Edmunds thing, like, it's a sticking point for the Mafia there. It's, you're either love them or you hate them. And there's a lot of folks that I think really pay attention to what's going on, that see that he's not there. He's not everything you would expect him to be. Because if you go back and look at his measurables, he's supposed to be like, he's 100 percentile in linebacker. He has like every
Right.
trait
He's
that you
young
could
and he's a crazy
possibly want.
athlete.
Yeah, he has every trait that you could want. Even his weight to height to arms to hand ratio is all like almost 100%. Right. So it's like you want it to work, and maybe it will. I just, to me, watching it, it feels a little delayed all the time. And
Yeah.
he's way too high when he engages linemen, and he gives up and he gets beat up by linemen immediately, because they're bigger and heavier than he is. And he tries to get his hands on them, but he comes so high, they just like gently move him out of the way. Right. I feel like if he would just like get a little more bend, or figure out a different angle to come at some of these guys, he would be much more disruptive than what he is right now. I don't know. You
Right.
got
Being
me
a top
bashing him now.
athlete at linebacker is just he's an easy target. Because he doesn't. It's just not a very exciting role as well. He's playing that sort of linebacker, and I don't want to say Mike, because it's meaningless and it doesn't really mean anything. But he is absolutely not out there making plays as much as Jordan Poyer and Matt Milano is. So I'm not sure that's worth 11 million a year, or whatever the hell he's gonna pay on his second contract. I hope he turns it around. I hope he looks good, but unconvinced at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in the same boat. And the way that you have to judge it, as you mentioned, some of these other guys, is like, when you put on the tape of those other guys, you see them flashing around, you see them being disruptive. Now, granted, I don't know exactly what he's being asked to do, right? Right now, it looks like he's being asked to just eat up the block. It just like hold his lane,
Yeah,
I
it's a lot of
guess.
that.
But that's what it looks
There's
like
a
to me
lot of
most
that,
of
and
the
there's a
time.
lot of playing shallow zone. Sorry.
Yeah, no,
Yeah, I'm standing around in.
I've been watching a lot of him, really getting ready to talk to you. I really started focusing in on him, because he is a hot topic. And it was like, yeah, it's really easy to see. And if he doesn't go too shallow and he gets even further back, then the coverage is going to be even worse. I mean, you're going to lose. He has to be close to the line, or he has to be like perfectly lined up. You see, I was watching against New England. I think it was week 16 or whatever. And Cam Newton was just using him and abusing him with his calls, right? You could see that he was like, it was clearly like he was just off a little bit the entire time. The play would go and be like, there's the hole, go hit it. And no, he would be outside and he'd be getting eaten up. And it was like, wait, there's the hole, go. No, you're going the wrong way. Wait, no, you're not going the right way. And Cam Newton is doing that to him. So I do feel like he gets toyed with a little bit, and that hurts him. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
But
going up against Belichick game planning is pretty difficult, right? It's no shock being mentally outmaneuvered when you're up against him and McDaniels. But I agree. I think that whole defense. We'll talk about things they need to do better, and there's a few obvious things as well. But they need to get much better at adapting to different game plans and different sorts of teams next year.
yeah, it's interesting because they seem to be one of the teams that I would say are better prepared. But it for some reason, maybe it is just because they're keeping the defense so vanilla that they don't have very much that they really are having to prepare for. But they have extreme confidence in the back end, or we can't even really call it the back end because Poyer's down in the box probably more than he is in the back end. But they're so confident in the back end, I feel like that they don't get as aggressive, which feels really weird to me. That if you have that much confidence in your two guys at the back, why you're not more aggressive, especially when you have a star cornerback who can hold up his own against just about anybody in the league, right? Like I feel like we're set up to be a defense that's a lot more aggressive than what we are.
It's a really good point, actually, and a few people have made the case that maybe the Bills were bad at what they were bad at defensively last year on purpose, because you win in the NFL by defending the pass really well. And the Bills know that, they're smart. So the theory goes, who knows if it's true, that will basically be super tight and super sound on the back end. And if teams want to run it on us for 4.5 yards a pop, good luck, because you're not going to beat us that way. And it's easy to say that now from the outside looking in, and maybe we're adding 2 and 2 and making 5, but it works. They won a lot of games. They're a really competitive team last year, and overall the defense, although it wasn't a strength, sort of held up their end of the bargain. So if you can get teams just to run on you, that's fine, so long as they're not taking over and abusing you for 300 yards or whatever. And it didn't really happen last year, so maybe it's on purpose. And if you were doing that, then you wouldn't go crazy on blitzes, and you wouldn't run a huge number of stunts and things like that. You just sort of let the offense come at you. So we might be giving them much more credit than they deserve here by saying they were bad at stopping the run on purpose. But it's definitely possible. I don't think it's a crazy suggestion. We should talk about the edge whilst we're at it as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, because
so pass rush
obviously
wise last year,
we didn't get
they were
pass
pretty
rush.
good.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
thought it was decent last year.
They didn't. I thought it was effective. I didn't think they blitzed a lot, and I didn't think they were a big pass rush team. And because of game scripts and the way it was going, then they didn't really need to. So that's a bit of chicken and egg around there. But I thought they were effective. I thought they got a lot done, considering the pass rush was basically a flat 4-man line on every single snap, and Quinton Jefferson not doing nearly as much as Ed Oliver. And then that sort of deep rotation on edge that the Bills have used for several years. And clearly, having drafted Rousseau and Ebenezer last year and Carlos Basham, they're planning on continuing it. It's going to be 4 or 5 guys on the edge every single game, as it has been.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you felt like they weren't doing that well, but they were doing well. It was just both sides were never effective at the same time, right? It was either like Jerry had a good game and then the other side was like non-existent, or the other side was good and Jerry had like not a good game. It was like they could just never actually get it together. And I don't know if that's because of the rotation, or I've always been a fan of the rotation because I like the idea of keeping a fresh guy and letting him go. But I also can see the piece of it where a guy wants to get in there and just work and keep working and keep working so he can really see what the guy's up to that he's going against to try to beat him, right? And really get in the mode and try to really get after it. But I feel like with these young guys, I mean, that's you watch the Tampa Bay Buccaneers win the Super Bowl with defense. I mean, you mentioned it kind of a moment ago that the Bills defense wasn't terrible, but if our offense wasn't as good as it was, it could have been completely different, right? So I think this offseason we really went big, long, tall, and fast at the edge, right? I mean, like, hey, let's try something different. Plus, we are sitting with 2 guys at 33 and 34 years old that are your primary rushers right now, right? So something's got to give, and you got to find it fast, or you're going to take a big hit on defense.
I've been an enormous fan of Jerry Hughes. I think he's been a really good player for a long time, but he's not a good finisher. He creates a lot of pressure, but doesn't really finish a lot of them off. And you're totally right; he's not getting any younger. So I think it's a fascinating example. We fans in the NFL, team draft someone in the first 2, maybe 3 rounds, and we go, "Oh, he's definitely going to be a star because they draft him really early. They must have a plan." And I think NFL teams have really figured out that actually, any draft pick is total lottery and a gamble. As much as their GM will say, only I know what's happening. You have to give me $1 million a year because I can see the future.
Right.
But they'll draft someone like Gregory Rousseau. Even 2 or 3 years ago, that would have happened, and everyone at home would have gone, well, of course he's going to play every single snap because it's first round pick. He must do. And the Bills are going into this with their eyes open. They're going, we don't want him to do that. We want him to play 30, 35 snaps a game, and exactly the reason you've been talking about, right? Which is a bunch of really big ends. So Rousseau, Basham, AJ Epinesa is huge. My boy F.A. Abada, London's very own.
Yep.
Big fan of Abada here. A rotation of those 4 guys with a bit of Mario Addison, with a bit of Jerry Hughes, who are definitely much smaller, speedier rushers than those. That's just really hard work over the course of 65 snaps, much more so than, your rookie getting knackered and not really doing a lot after the third quarter. So I think it's really set up for the Bills defense to carry on being sound, efficient, but not spectacular and pretty boring.
Yeah, I think they're just looking for that one guy that just kind of becomes a little bit of the superstar, right? That's what they're hoping for, is just, let's just keep rolling him out there. We're going to stay consistent. We're going to keep being just good at what we do. Hopefully the offense keeps scoring points, and maybe one of these guys is going to turn into something exceptional, right? I mean, that's all we can really hope for at this point, because they're not, especially now, I don't think we're going to be in a position again where we're going to be drafting towards the top for a long time, where we're going to truly be able to get like that game-changing defensive edge, where you're going to come up and get that guy. Like, that's not going to happen in our future anytime soon, I don't think. And we definitely aren't going to be spending the money because we're going to have to pay Josh Allen. So I don't think we're going out and getting any expensive defensive ends in free agency anytime soon in the near future either. So we're in a position where it's going to have to happen through the draft. So we're going to have to see if Brandon Beane is as good as he's appeared to have been so far in drafting. I mean, they're at least keeping a good solid team together at this point. So
yeah, exactly. And no team and no GM is really good at drafting. You just get lucky for a few years, and then it all goes horribly wrong because the draft is terrible like that. But I just looking at the pass rush, I'm just calling off numbers because that tends to be what I do. But last year, the Bills, in terms of pure pressure, 310 pure pressure in the regular season, which is good for 55th overall in 352 teams in the last 11 years. So they're generating a lot of pressure, but you said it's not spectacular, and there's not one guy out there who the commentators' names are screaming. It's not one guy getting 150 of those pressures like Aaron Donald or some crazy interior player. It's just consistent pressure all the way through the defense, which is how the Patriots have rushed the passer for years, right? The Patriots don't generate star pass rushers. They're just a really good pass rushing team. And that's not a bad template.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've been saying that for the longest time. It's like you had the playbook in your division. I mean, they showed you for 17 years how to build a successful team, right? It doesn't necessarily need stars. It's great if you can get them, or if somebody can burst onto the scene and become a star for your team. That's awesome. But it's interesting. 55 out of 352, you said?
Yeah, so pressures are up there. So just slight expectation. Last 11 years is really difficult, right? But I've used this database, so it should be 10. I should change it. But out of all those 352 teams, 32 times 11, obviously, they were 55th in total pressures, which is great. If you look at sack efficiency, i.e., how many of those pressures you turn into sacks, they were 250th. Out of those 352, right. So way down the bottom. So basically, you've got a team that's generating a load of pressure, that's getting in quarterback's face and making their life difficult, but not putting them on the floor. And that's a bit of a Jerry Hughes thing to do anyway. But that's happening over the whole team. So if someone said talk to you about a defense like that, you'd probably have someone like the Bills in your mind, right? You'd go, that's an effective way to build a defense across the year. It's just dull and not very memorable, and probably a lot of people don't know how good they were because like you and me, they're not watching Bills defense man by man.
Right. So, I mean, and it would change incredibly if they just finished, right? If they got 8 more sacks than they had the previous year, even that would change completely. I mean, especially watching it as a fan and as actually watching it, when you can bring the guy down, I mean, that makes all the world to the fan. And, but the fact that they're that good as far as getting there is still a positive sign, right? It doesn't seem to reflect that
massively.
well in the running, but I mean, that's a positive sign.
I know, honestly, it fluctuates anyway. So we tend to believe that finishing is a player thing, and we talked about Jerry Hughes being not very good at it, and there's a few others. Brandon Graham famously is a really bad finisher, and someone like Chandler Jones is a brilliant finisher. But aside from a handful of players who are particularly good or bad at that, it's pretty random, and it fluctuates massively season by season, game by game. And the reason is because it's not the pass rusher that's defining whether it's a pressure or a sack; it's the quarterback. It's just whether he happens to get the ball out, or whether he happens to be looking the wrong way, or whether it happens to get hit as he's throwing it. So yeah, obviously it's gonna have high variance. It's gonna be a little bit random, and that's what you're seeing. It's just it happens to look that way. So last year the Packers, really bad pass rushing team, not good at all, but they got a huge number of their pressures on the stat sheet in terms of sacks. So people think that the Packers are really good pass rushers, and it's just not true.
It's interesting. Based on all of your numbers for the season, who was the best overall defense?
The Rams. I think the
Rams?
Rams were the best defense last year, and obviously the defensive coordinators left to go and take charge of the Chargers. But similar to what we were talking about, the Bills, the Rams were probably the most innovative defense last year and the most effective. So that whole defense was built off, we sort of don't really care about the middle of the defense. We're going to remain gap sound up front, because otherwise you just get absolutely gashed in the running game. So you've got to do that. So we'll roll out our little 4-man line and weird asymmetric line they run. Basically, Aaron Donald is on one edge, and then the other side, you've got Leonard Floyd. I do remember people talking about Leonard Floyd being in the playoffs. One of the commentators said, Leonard Floyd, there's no better pass rusher in the NFL. I'm like, you should probably watch any other pass rusher, and that'll change. Typical nonsense. But anyway, and they basically played. Oh, sorry, someone's drilling downstairs. I hope you can't hear that.
Oh, that's all right.
That's terrifying. Anyway, and on the back end, they were just in dime the whole time, right? It was a one linebacker defense, and they rolled out a third safety most of the season. And offenses didn't really see it coming. They didn't really adapt very well, and it was the most interesting modern defense out there.
And I mean, is that safe to say that they're most able to do it because of Aaron Donald? I mean, does that feel like, is there other defenses that are doing something similar?
Yeah, it definitely helps when you've got a Hall of Famer like that. You can build your defense around. Yeah, right. I think other teams did start adapting it a little bit. So most notably, the Titans and the Giants started doing a lot of that. So without getting really dorky, college defensive front trends going on are the mint front and the tight front, right? And the tight is basically a nose tackle and 2 defensive ends right out, just shading inside the tackles, sort of a 3-man front. And you quite often put an extra linebacker up on the line of scrimmage. It turns into a tight front. There's a bit more, but whatever. Talk about that. But both of those defenses quite often look like these real unbalanced defenses. So you get a big end and a little end, fairly similar to the old Seahawks defense. But for the Rams, that means you've got Aaron Donald, who people talk about as defensive tackle, but he's quite often outside lining up or outside the offensive tackle. So he's an edge. He's playing on the edge of the offensive line. And the other side, you've got Leonard Floyd. And then the Giants famously had Leonard Williams doing that. So Leonard Williams is a huge guy, right? Drafted as a defensive tackle, whatever that means. But in the second half of last year, they pushed him right out wide, and he was playing outside the tackle a lot. And then the other end, they were ruined. So they had no players. It was just a rotation of people. But they've got Lorenzo Carter, and they just drafted Azeez Ojulari, real small speed rushers like that. So the big guy and the little guy, there's obviously some gap moves and some other things going on. And then the Titans, you've got something very similar. Jarrell Casey is sort of out there playing that big role, and then they had Harold Landry. Now that might change with Bud Dupree coming in, but I think a lot more teams are starting to look at that front as a real way to attack defenses, and it's very interesting.
Yeah, that's it. You notice that a lot. And I'm hoping that the Bills are going to try to do that a little bit, because the guys that we brought in this season and they've shown in college that they can move around the line a little bit. I think even if you can just incorporate that, right? I mean, it just changes, like, okay, now their speed is coming from the inside instead of the outside. I mean, even like things like that, I feel like are simple little things that we could do that we don't even really do. Mm-hmm. But I mean, when you have like the backup is like Trent Murphy, and like, I mean, you can only expect him to do so much, right? I mean, like, and as Penenza, he just has not had a chance to learn how to play this game yet. I mean, at this level, he just hasn't had that opportunity with the no off season and everything like that. So, I mean, this off season, I think, will be a huge thing for him, especially when they went right back out and drafted two more guys, right? So there, you've got to feel like,
Yeah,
well, I better
totally
step
agree.
it up immediately, or I might not be here for very long, right? So it's
I mean, the
interesting, but
2020 rookie class was. Sorry, dude.
no, go ahead.
The 2020 rookie class was awful. There's a couple of players that did really well, but for the most part, they were absolutely awful. And for exactly the reason that you just said, it's because they basically didn't get any hands-on NFL coaching. Their whole first preseason, which is the hardest adaptation, was done on a Zoom call. And they didn't really know anybody. And man, we all know how difficult that is as we sit here talking to each other on the far side of the world. So I'm expecting the whole of last year's rookie class to basically look a lot better. And Epinese is going to be one of those guys, right? So going back to that sort of rotationary edge concept, if you're lining up on one snap and you've got Jerry Hughes, little, fast, very wily, very skillful, got a lot of moves, got a good plan. And the next one's AJ Epinese, who's 6'5" and super heavy and basically a raw power end. And that's really difficult to adapt, just in terms of lineman footwork and what your kick step looks like. You're going to get caught out by that sort of player and that sort of contrast.
Right, just absolutely ask you
Can't
to
wait to
them
see
to
it.
game plan for so much more, right? I mean, like you can't just get, oh, I'm going to get Jerry Hughes all day, right? So let me just learn Jerry Hughes.
Yeah,
Like, well, no, you're going to get Jerry Hughes on this play, you're going to get so and so on this play you're going to get somebody else. So you got to be ready. I mean, I love the concept. I mentioned that earlier. I think it's the way to go. If you can pull it off, you've got to find the right group of guys, and it definitely helps if your inside interior guys can, fill their roles as well. And I felt like the year before, and I don't know. To me, this, you've mentioned it a couple of times, the no off season, like a lot of these teams talking about not doing the OTAs and stuff, and guys boycotting it and things like that. I'm like, that feels like craziness to me. Again, that you just watched like how bad of a product it can produce, and especially for your young players. I get some of the vets not wanting to do it or whatever, but like your young players, and I think I'd read somewhere too, like the Bills had like 23 players or 25 players that have workout bonuses. I mean, so you're just asking guys to throw away money as well, to not show up for just these few things. So I think camaraderie and, having the game plan and the knowledge of the game plan and not having to change too much is such a huge
yep.
aspect in the NFL that you can't go without it, right? I mean, it feels really wrong to go without it.
I totally agree, and especially for a defense like the Bills, which is very much scheme based rather than player based. Now, obviously, every defense is scheme based because that's sort of an oxymoron. But this is a defense that prides itself on, we've got a very strong and effective and sensible and established plan, and everyone knows their role in it. Going back to that Patriots thing, rather than we've got a couple of stud guys on our defense, and we're just going to sort of highlight them as much as you can ever highlight anyone on defense because it's reactive.
Right. Absolutely. 100% would agree with that. So if you were just looking at what's been done so far this offseason by everybody, who are you anticipating is going to be back at the top? I mean, the Rams didn't really change very much, so they could absolutely be back up there, right? I mean, do you think that Tampa Bay's defense is going to be as stout as it was? I mean, is there any
Good
AFC
question.
team that you think is going to have a good shot at Kansas City?
So I don't think the Rams or the Bucks defense will be as good as they are, but for very different reasons. So the Rams, obviously, the coordinator left. One of the brightest, most exciting minds in defensive football has gone. He's playing for a different team, so that'll be really interesting. Raheem Morris has taken over the defense, and he's sort of come out and said the things you normally do about we're going to retain a load of the scheme and blah blah blah. But historically, Raheem Morris has run a very different system, so we'll see what that looks like on the field. But I defense is very unstable. They are almost certain not to be the best defense again, so I think it's really going to hurt. The Bucks are really interesting. So the Bucks are the most stable defense last year by a million miles. The number one thing you can do to make your defense good is not anyone get injured. So you remember that great Jacksonville defense, 2017, maybe 18?
Yeah.
That was the most incredible defense because no one got hurt. Like, no one got hurt all season. I think Miles Jack missed 2 games or something like that. And they were just very stable and very established and very well drilled. And they did really well. And last year, the Bucks, no one got hurt. Vita Vea went down and got hurt. And there was a couple of other sort of 1 or 2 game injuries. But they were together all year. It's absolutely incredible. Their 2 edge rushers played like 900 snaps each. Absolutely amazing. And that's not going to happen again. More than half of starting NFL defenders miss games every single season. And it's 25-30% miss at least 3 games, something like that. So they're just not going to stay as healthy. So I definitely think we're going to see some regression from them. Then you got Devin White, that it's just, he had such a black swan season in terms of how productive he was from what he was doing. So that's not going to happen again. The Bucks are still a good team. They still might do very well, but it's not going to be there. The defense I most like to repeat is neither of those. I think it's Washington, actually, the football team without a name. So last year, arguably, the best defense in the league were the Rams. The Steelers were right up there, and I would say Washington. And they're not very flashy. I mean, everyone talks about Chase Young because, big name and drafted and cool hair and all the normal sorts of things. But they were just a very, very sound defense. And again, very good on the back end. Not a lot of stars in that secondary, apart from Landon Collins, who got hurt. But they were very good. The one problem they had was a void of talent at linebacker. John Bostic was their best linebacker, and then a bunch of other people. I'm a fan of Kevin Pierre-Louis. He should be a really good player. He's a great athlete. He can move. He can play in the slot, all those things. He's just not very good. And it's never quite happened. Cole Holcomb is just a guy for me. But they've gone out there and they've drafted a linebacker in the first round. They've basically kept their team together. Chase Young is, we said every rookie last year was bad. Chase Young was pretty good, and he is going to be a stud this year. He definitely belongs in that top 6-7 elite edge rushers. So I think they've got the most chance in that top echelon from last year of staying there again.
Yeah, that's exactly. I've been every fantasy thing that I've been doing. That's been my grab is Washington defense. I feel like they just, and especially because I feel like their offense got better as well. So I think they're going to put teams in situations where they're going to have to play catch up a little bit more than they're used to against that team, and it's not going to fare well against that defense because that defense is stout. Then I actually like the Giants defense a little bit too. I think they're doing some good things over there. They need some help a little bit, but I do like what they're up to. I think they're building a solid defense over there too.
I'm with you. Giants are really interesting, actually, and we sort of laugh about the Giants because David Gettleman, he doesn't know what he's doing, and all the sort of typical things. And then the offense, the offense isn't great because they're built around a terrible quarterback, but defensively they are so well coached. Joe Judge, it appears to be one of the ex-Patriots coaches that really can do those things. He changes game plan by opponents. He changes the scheme and the coaching mid-season. He's got everyone playing well. And last year that was a really good defense, probably top 10. Maybe top 8 at times, and they seem really, really well put together. So great shout, actually. I can't wait to see it. The thing about Giants defense, I want to see what the pass rush looks like. So we talked about that sort of big end and little end and asymmetric fronts. Leonard Williams, fine. He'll look really good there. On the other end, you got Ashani Jimenez, you got Lorenzo Carter, and Azeez Ojulari. And all of them have got reasons to be excited, but none of them are proven NFL players. So is it going to work? Is one of them going to turn into Leonard Floyd? Maybe. Can 3 of them sort of combine into a good season? Maybe. Don't know. I can't wait to see it.
Yeah, I think they intrigue me too. It's funny that I think most of the defenses that I'm looking at are all on the NFC side of the ball. I haven't really. There's nobody on the AFC side that I'm like, man, defensively they're just really scare me. I don't know that there's any team that's like that right now.
In the AFC, who should we talk about? I don't want to talk about Chiefs. You have to talk about the Chargers. It's the law. So when you talk about the Chargers in the offseason, you have to say they've got the best, most balanced roster in the league, and they're really deep defensively. It's just the law. You have to talk about that. I don't believe it. I don't think the Chargers are that good. Joey Bosa is an absolute stud, but Derwin James as well. I think there's massive holes on their roster, same as there has been the last few years, to be honest. Let's talk about Cleveland. Cleveland are really interesting in the AFC. Potentially, I think I'd be shocked if they're not a playoff team and a real risk to win a game in January at this point. And it's a really well put together and much upgraded defense. And it starts with cornerback, right? Cornerback is arguably the most important position on defense. And you've got Denzel Ward, who is a stud. You've got Greedy Williams, who was pretty good, missed last year, and then they drafted Greg Newsome in the first round. So if you can get 2 out of those 3 looking really good, John Johnson on the back end is a fantastic player. A bunch of other talented people who may or may not take off. Myles Garrett, one of the best defenders in the NFL, could be a really good defense. You'll need to get lucky, and you'll need a few things to pan out, which we're guessing at the moment, but they've certainly got that potential.
Yeah, I mean the cornerback's been their Achilles heel for them just the past couple of seasons. It hasn't been the front, hasn't been the safeties. It's just been they haven't been able to find the cornerbacks to really be shut down enough to let that line really eat the way that they could. I think they're.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that we're gonna one day get to experience a Cleveland versus Buffalo in the AFC Championship, because it's like the most, like 25 years ago, nobody in their right mind would have ever been like, yeah, that's going to happen. Right. And now it's turned into like, they both have really good football teams out of nowhere. So it's pretty exciting.
Yeah. But man, that sounds cold.
But
Cleveland Buffalo in January is just, ooh.
It'd be awesome. That'd be awesome. The Battle of Lake Erie for the AFC Championship. That's what they need to do. But so let's move into we're getting close towards kind of wrapping this thing up, and I like to move into the nerding out session, because I know, not that we haven't been nerding out the whole time, actually, because your love of defense is, it's so fun to listen to it as you get going and just start chatting and like having fun with it. It's a blast. But so as we go into the nerding out session, what's your favorite book? You've obviously probably read a ton of books, I'm guessing. So what's your favorite sports book or book that you would recommend?
Well, that's a great question. A sports book. Oh, there's a shelf of them downstairs. I mean, probably I'd go for an obscure rugby book, but that's probably not the right audience for that. So I'm going to say War Room. If anybody hasn't read War Room, we've talked about the Patriots and team building quite a lot. I think it's absolutely brilliant. There's so much of what went into building that great Patriots team, and a lot of the great coaches, and there's a lot of Dimitrov in there, and Scott Pioli and Belichick. I think it's absolutely brilliant. So if anybody's interested in sort of how a really good team was run for a decade, I strongly recommend having a read of that. What was the other question? Favorite overall book. So you should do it. So I'll tell you a good book recommendation I'm going to make, because I can. Flashman. Everyone should read Flashman. So super English, right? So Tom Brown's School Days was a very famous Victorian book about this kid who went to a posh school and basically got bullied. And there's a bully in it called Flashman, and there's a series of books around him, which is basically him traveling the world, going to war in the 1800s and causing trouble and making friends with ladies. You should read Flashman. They're great.
Interesting. All right, cool. I want to check that out for sure. So the next one, I think you kind of almost answered this in the very beginning a little bit, but what brought you to the game of football, or like, what do you love about the game?
Oh man, everything. It's the gift that keeps giving. So I obviously am an Englishman. I come from different sports, and I come from a soccer, football background, and played a lot of rugby. And where I am with those is they're relatively simple games to master. So not in terms of playing them, because frankly I was never any good. I was a very average player in both, but understanding them is pretty simple. And there's a bunch of arguments at the top, but they're not tactically that deep. There's not that many decisions. It's sort of go out and be better at doing certain things on the field. The NFL I've always found was deeper and deeper and deeper. The more I know, the more I realized I didn't know. And it started off with sort of understanding the differences between different sorts of players. I was teaching myself this stuff, and I was sitting there in my bedroom at university working out what LILB and LOLB stood for. I had no idea. I couldn't Google it because Google barely existed. So it was just really difficult learning that stuff. And the more I learned, And now, hopefully, I like to think I'm at a position where I can help in overall understanding of defense by breaking down what different schemes do and how much teams use different things and stuff like that, rather than the basic, they're a 3-4 defense and they do this on early downs and then switch to this on third down. A lot of those things are just wrong and simplistic and silly. So at the risk of massively blowing my own trumpet and pretending I'm something I'm very much not, it's the complexity, and it is learning more about it. And I like the intellectual side of how it all comes together. I think it's endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it's a game that's cool. It's like, as basic as it is, it's always going to change, right? Because there's going to be somebody that has a new idea, or somebody that wants to try something different to see if it'll work. I mean, just because you can. I mean, like, you might come across this player that just gives you an opportunity to do something you've never had the ability to do before, and you're like, hey, we're going to do that now, right? So the game is endlessly giving in what you can learn from it, for sure. So when you're not doing football all the time, Tom, or even. Yeah, the trends are very cool. It's interesting to see how long they can last, right? Like, because they get beat up pretty badly sometimes, like the Wildcat disappeared after a little while. There's just interesting things. Like, it almost looks like Belichick's going to bring back the 2 tight end concept in New England, right? So it's going to be interesting to see some things this season to see what takes place.
Yeah, I mean, I can't
So-
wait to see what the NFL does in terms of defending RPOs this year, because RPOs have been, probably the biggest defensive trend for the last 2 or 3 years, and they've been enormously effective. So all the defensive minds are out there going, well, how can I take those away, and how can I specifically drill players to respond to them better? I think we're going to see that this year. Hopefully, a lot more than we did last year. Should be cool.
That'll be awesome, because that's the most annoying play, right? It's like, it ruins everything. You can't pass rush, you can't do anything, because it's like 2 seconds and it's over, so it's a terrible thing. But so when you got free time, Tom, what's a podcast you listen to?
Oh, great question. I mainly just listen to football podcasts, to be honest. So I commute an hour each way to work when I'm not working from the office that you can see me in here. So I listen to a lot of football podcasts, and my favorite one, I'm going to go for PFF football podcast, actually. So, I'm an early PFF adopter. I was following them back when it was free, and it was just really badly designed and a handful of people knocking stuff together. So I very much appreciate their views on football and how they think it works. I don't agree with them everything. I think they have some things wrong and some disagreements with them. But I think they are independent and interesting. And in the area of football, I particularly love defense. There is a lot of tendency for even mainstream figures to sort of churn out the same nonsense platitudes over and over again. We talked about Leonard Floyd being heralded as a great pass rush earlier. And these things are just wrong. But to be fair, people in the media and the companies don't spend a lot of time on it, because fans don't want it and they don't care. They're not interested in it. So they don't have any incentive to learn and get better. I think PFF are really good on the defensive side, and they're very good at analysing and understanding which players are good and what good looks like on defense.
Yeah, for me, the big network guys, I don't take what they say very often, right? Because it's like, how much of it are you really watching? You can't, if this is what you're doing, you're on TV all the time, you're doing show after show after show, how much are you really able to watch the game to really tell me what's going on, other than you looked at a few clips and were like, yeah, so this is what's taking place. And it's like, well, no, that's what took place on 3 plays that you looked at, but that's not what took place in the whole game,
Yeah.
right? So
strongly agree.
Let me ask you this, Tom, and
There was
closing
a
out
game
for
last
the nerding
year.
out. Yeah.
Sorry, I was going to pipe up and talk about a specific player. So I was watching one game last year, and the little talking head box thing when they introduce the defense. This is our starting defense, and it sort of names them. And I was watching the Raiders, and they went, "Yeah, LaMarcus
Right.
Joyner, strong safety." I was like, "Have you watched the Raiders play? He's been in the slot for like a year and a half. He's absolutely not that. You just don't know what that means."
Yeah, those are always the worst. Half the time they don't have the guy even close. It's like, so did anybody even bother to look at this before you let this guy spit it out and say it, that this is completely
so
wrong?
weird.
But they
So
don't care.
weird.
People aren't there for that half the time. I mean, realistically.
Yeah, exactly. So no one cares, no one notices. So it only matters to people like us.
So let me ask you last question, Tom. What is one play or like player or like just a flag or something that you were just like sticks with you, that just you remember when you're thinking back to just like, oh, that was a terrible player. This player had a terrible season, or just like that flag was the worst thing ever. What's something that sticks with you?
I'm going to go for the obvious answer for this one, and I'm sure it's. Well, I suspect a lot of people think about it, but the funniest and the most amusing and just terrible bit of football that summed up a really badly run organization is butt fumble. So staying with the AFC East theme, the butt fumble play is just endlessly amusing. It's probably the play I watch most in the history of the NFL, because it just makes me giggle. It was so badly done. It was just a terribly put together play, which was executed really badly by a team that put all their faith in Rex Ryan, who could build a defense but clearly couldn't lead an organization. I know they got a couple of AFC title games. Butt fumble just sums up how badly that Jets team was unraveling. And I find it endlessly amusing.
No, in me being an AFC East guy, I absolutely love that play as well, right? The only thing that was negative about all that was we ended up getting Rex Ryan for a few years, right? That was the only part that really sucked about it, is we ended up getting him and he was not a good head coach. I mean, it's just plain and simple. He was just not a good head coach. Yeah. Yeah, neither of
He
them
did
were.
have that sweet Bills truck, though. That was amazing.
That's right. And I think finally the Jets have rebounded. It took them all the way up until probably like 2 years ago before they've actually like turned a corner where they might actually start being competitive and do something right for a change.
Man, I hope so. So every offseason, I started out being a fan of one team, and I realised that it's much more fun for me personally to not be a fan and just follow the sport. So every offseason I go into it, and I really want the bad teams to get much better, and in particular the teams that have been bad for a long time. So I'm strongly cheering for the Jets and the Jags and the Raiders to somehow turn themselves around. Now the Raiders clearly not going to, because man, that's a badly run organization. But hopefully the other two, I mean, we might see some sparks. I probably can't see it with the Jags either. But you're right, the Jets are really interesting. You look at their roster and you look at the way they're building their team and the coaching appointment and think, I can see how this could work. Now it's the Jets, so it's not going to. Obviously, it's going to go horribly wrong in an embarrassing and funny ways. But you can look at it and go, I might be sitting here in a year thinking you're on the right track.
Yeah, I do. I agree with that because I think the GM is good. I think it's Joe Douglas, right, as the GM over there now. I think he's good. I think he's making some wise moves and he's making some good decisions to at least get more players there, because that's all they've really been lacking is more quality players. I mean, they just don't have depth anywhere. But
yeah, I mean, the cornerback is particularly funny. If you look at that group of cornerbacks, they're all day 3 draft picks who have never really been very good. And that is a serious worry. And the Jets haven't had a good pass rusher for 20 years. So there are some problems, but hopefully Robert Saleh can at least install some sort of good defense. And he's a good coach.
yeah, we'll see. I mean, I'm okay with it. I mean, I'm okay with 2 wins a year if they come easily. That's okay. I mean, I'm fine with that. So if they don't want to get it together, we can stay this path. I'm okay with that too. But Tom, thanks so much for coming on and chatting with me, man. I really appreciate it. When I reached out, I was a little stunned that you're like, yeah, I'd love to do it. I was like, all right, sweet. This is going to be like a major nerding out session talking about defense. So it was going to be a blast. And I want to give you an opportunity. Is there anything that you want to shout out or anything you're working on or anything you want to tell people about?
Well, thank you for having me on. Firstly, I spent a lot of years sort of not really having people to talk to about football in the same way that I enjoyed it. So it's cool that I get to talk to people halfway around the world and have a good fun conversation. What I'm working on at the moment is just crafting my projections really. So every year I do detailed projections for every single defensive player in the NFL. So it's about 1,000 players. It's quite complicated. There's quite a lot of stuff going on, and obviously that takes months and months of trying to make predictions and adjust sliders and all that sort of stuff. So I'll be posting quite a lot of that. Come and find me on Twitter. You mentioned earlier the handbook I put together of last year. Again, blowing my own trumpet. I think it's interesting. I think it's good. I think it gives you some tools to look at defense and sort of define what's going on in a few different ways. So I'm going to say, go read every slide. It's free. It's available. You can download it. You can keep it. Do whatever you want with it. So just come and have a look at my Twitter account. It's my pinned tweet.
Yeah. And of course, all that stuff will be available for you guys in the show notes for how to connect with Tom. And it's going to be that document. I think you should go check it out. I mean, like you said, it's free, so it doesn't take anything but just clicking on it. And I think you're going to be stunned, especially if you like want to just know more about defense. Even if you don't want to look at all the team stuff, just go down to the appendix and really see about the breakdown of like how things are done and how it was kind of put together. And you'll probably learn more in just those few slides about the game than you have in watching it for 25 years. And you've been calling something totally wrong, right? Probably. But so thanks a lot for coming on, Tom. Absolutely. Everybody go check out his stuff. It's really good. I mean, I think people miss about how important it is to like put numbers and really investigate into what's going on in the game, especially if you're doing fantasy and like things of that nature. I mean, you got to know numbers and you got to know about what's taking place if you really want to be good at any of this stuff. So go check it out. Thanks again, everybody, for listening in, though. Wouldn't have a show if there wasn't people listening. So I appreciate you guys. Obviously, you guys can find me over at the Buffalo Nerd, everything I'm up to. Tom, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. And make sure you guys go check out, we'll have the Cure CJD. All their information will be available in the notes as well. All right, everybody. Thanks a lot.
You just listen to the Buffalo Nerd Sports Podcast. Make sure you leave a review and subscribe so you never miss another episode. We'll see you next time. Leg out!